All right, hello everyone. I am going to be lecturing today on chapter 3 related to biological psychology. I'm only going to be covering the first half of the chapters, so it'll be really important that you read through the textbook and watch any of the included videos that I made for you on the brain. What I'm going to focus on today are neurons, how neurons communicate with each other, and then a little bit about the nervous system and the endocrine system. And again, when you're reading through the lecture, make sure to focus a little bit more than on the different parts of the brain and watch any of the videos that I did include for you. So let's talk a little bit about neurons. And I think sometimes people struggle with this topic because neurons are so small. They're not something that you can put your hands on or directly see with the naked eye. In order to see neurons or watch them communicate, you would have to do so under a very high-powered microscope. But hopefully we can make them a little more accessible for you today. Neurons are little individual cells that are the smallest unit of the nervous system. You can almost think about them as the building blocks of the nervous system, right? They play an incredibly crucial role in just about everything that we do. And the brain of the average human contains 100 billion or more of these neurons. And there are even more of them, billions and billions more throughout other parts of the nervous system and the body. So they really are a very key piece of our ability to interact with the world, to communicate, and to carry out just about every action that we do. So let's look a little bit at some of the different parts of a neuron and different types, and then we'll talk a little about how they communicate with each other. So there's no such thing as like a typical neuron, but if we look at some of the typical elements of a neuron or typical structures within one, I have this diagram here, and you'll notice on the study guide that I might ask you to label some of these parts of a neuron in addition to asking you what they do. So make sure that you know both. But if we look at this example of a neuron here, you can imagine that there would be another neuron here and another one on this side. Neurons don't exist in isolation. They exist in these really long chains. You can imagine there was a neuron, 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 right up, kind of going on and on and on to make up nerves, which make up the nervous system. But if we look at one in isolation for the moment, it starts here with these little tree-like branches called dendrites. And dendrites, their job is to receive messages from a neighboring neuron. They're going to pick up messages. They're almost reaching out to pull them in from a neighboring neuron or a neighboring cell. Once that message comes in, it's going to travel through the cell body, which we can call the life support center of a neuron. And it contains this little circle here, which is the nucleus containing all of our genetic information. So the message comes in through the dendrites, through the cell body, through the gender rights. I love the subtitles. They're doing a pretty good job, but still. The message comes in through the dendrites into the cell body, and then it's going to go down the axon, which is this long, slender tube which carries messages away from the cell body and down to the other neurons, muscles, and glands. And I always remembered that axon starts with A, and it carries messages away, whatever helps you to remember. But the message travels down this long, slender tube and down toward the end of that neuron. Now, this neuron that we're looking at here is covered with a myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath is made up of cells called glial cells, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But these cover the axon, helping with speed, helping to transmit messages more efficiently. They look like little fatty sausage links, just to give you a little breakfast food reference there. But once the message reaches the end of the axon, it hits what are called the terminal branches. Terminal branches, terminal just means end, right? So we're talking about the end branches of the axon with these little terminal buttons at the very, very end. And the terminal buttons contain neurotransmitters, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But these are some of the kind of general structures that you would find on a neuron. dendrites through the cell body and nucleus, the axon covered with the myelin sheath, and then we have the terminal branches and the little terminal buttons at the end. There are lots of different types of neurons, and I went into this quite a bit in the textbook about how we can distinguish different types by a couple of different methods. But let's focus for now on types of neurons by the different functions that they have. And so if we look at neurons in that way, we can talk about three different types. Sensory or afferent neurons is the first type. The second are motor or efferent neurons. And the third would be interneurons or association neurons. And these are named really well for their functions. Sensory neurons pick up information from the environment. Motor neurons are in charge of movements, and interneurons kind of help facilitate the process between the two. So named really nicely. I do have a little tutorial video on these that I'd like to share with you. And this is linked in the lecture for this week if you would like to watch it again. But I don't think they're the most exciting videos, but I do think they're really helpful. So let me pull that up here and share it with you, just kind of showing you how these three types work together. Okay.
There are three different types of neurons: sensory neurons, interneurons, motor neurons. Neurons are categorized into these three types on the basis of the body parts between which they provide communication links. Sensory neurons carry messages into the brain and spinal cord from the sense organs in the rest of the body. The sense organs include the eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and the different kinds of receptors in the skin. Interneurons carry messages from one neuron to another and integrate the actions of the sensory and motor neurons. Motor neurons carry information away from the brain and spinal cord to the muscles and glands. When you accidentally put your hand over a hot flame, it is important that you remove it immediately.
That's really good life advice for you right there. I love that. When you put your hand over a hot flame, it is important that you remove it immediately. Right. Life facts for you right there.
The three types of neurons work together to help you do that. First, the pain of the hot flame applied to the skin produces a burst of activity in the sensory neurons. Sensory neurons send signals to interneurons in the spinal cord. The interneurons, in their turn, activate motor neurons, and these neurons cause muscles to contract, triggering a quick withdrawal of your hand.
So again, well, let me get back to our PowerPoint so I can get the captions. The thing I love about those little tutorials is that they do kind of show you how these work together. So allowing you to detect the heat from the flame and then quickly withdraw your hand by having all three of these work together in a chain. And some good life advice mixed in there for you. I love that. So one other thing to talk about before we get into how neurons communicate with each other, there is a special type of cell that works very closely with neurons, and that is called a glial cell. Now, glial literally translates to mean glue. And for a lot of years, these were thought about as the glue cells of the nervous system. And in some ways, that's fairly accurate. They have a lot of supportive functions, and neurons really couldn't exist without their assistance. They hold neurons in place. They help provide nourishment and remove waste. They prevent harmful substances from passing from the bloodstream into the brain, kind of helping make up that blood-brain barrier. And they also form the myelin sheath that we talked about a couple of minutes ago that helps to insulate and make messages travel more quickly and efficiently. So really a very important helper cell. And we have billions and billions of these as well. I found a comic about them. You have no idea how hard it is to find a comic about glial cells, but I found one. The glial cell saying, "Hey, why doesn't anyone talk about me?" The neuron responds, "You don't do anything, that's why." And the glial cell, "That's not true, read this page," right? Again, these are kind of the unspoken, not talked about cells, but they play a very important supportive role. So to make it a little bit more complicated, let's talk about how neurons communicate with each other. So again, neurons don't exist in isolation. They exist in these long chains called nerves, which make up the nervous system, and they have to communicate with each other in order for messages to be passed on, in order for actions to be carried out. And when we talk about neural impulses and neurons communicating with each other, a really key phrase to remember is that they communicate through electrochemical impulses. And there's two elements to that. Electrochemical, we're going to look at an electrical element and a chemical element. And we need both in order for neurons to communicate with each other. So let's start with the electrical piece, and that has to do with ions. Ions, as we have right here, are these little electrically charged particles found both inside and outside of a neuron. And when we look at these, so you can see the little dots here on the outside and the little dots on the inside, those would be ions. And ions have an electrical charge to them. They're either positive or negative, almost like ends of a battery. And when these ions move and shift, they change the electrical composition of the neuron, causing it to fire or communicate or start a neural impulse. So let's look at a closer picture here just to help you out with this process. When neurons communicate with each other and this ion piece starts, I'm sorry, went to the wrong slide. We call that an action potential, the firing of a nerve cell. So when the ions flood in, which you can see happening right here, the positive ions flow in and the negative ions flow out. It causes a change in the electrical composition of the neuron. Now, when a neuron is resting, when it's not sending any communications, not sending any action potentials, there are more positive ions on the outside and negative on the inside. When a message is triggered, little semi-permeable gates open on the cell membrane, and the positive ions flow in and the negative ones flow out. And that causes the threshold of the ion to change, or I'm sorry, the threshold of the neuron to change. It goes from being largely negative to largely positive, triggering what's called the firing of a nerve cell or an action potential. There's a certain threshold that it has to cross in order for this to happen. Think about it like flipping on a light switch. Apply enough pressure and the switch turns on. If you do that, the action potential will occur, and it either happens all the way or not at all, which we call the all or none law. So this is the first piece. This is the electrical piece, that the ions cause a change in the electrical composition of the cell, causing it to fire. Now, it's going to hit a little bit of a snag here in a moment. The ions cause the firing of a nerve cell, but the tricky thing is that neurons aren't directly connected to each other. There's a tiny little space in between neurons called the synapse. And you can see it here in like a diagram form right here, and then under a high-powered microscope right here. But there's a tiny little space between the dendrites of one neuron and the terminal buttons and the end branches of the other. So in this little space, we have to bring in the chemical piece of communication in order for the message to keep going. So in order for that message to cross this gap, to cross the little space in between, we rely on chemicals called neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are things like dopamine, serotonin, glutamate, GABA. There's an incredible number of these. But these little neurotransmitter chemicals are housed in the synaptic vesicles of those terminal buttons. And when the message is stimulated, it causes them to be released and float across the synapse to hook up to little receptor sites on the other side. And by doing this, it keeps that message going. It floats across the synapse and keeps the communication going to the next neuron. Here's a little bit closer picture. So if you can imagine, here's the terminal branches and terminal buttons. And here's a close-up of a terminal button with these little synaptic vesicles right here. But the neurotransmitters float across, hook up on the other side, and they keep the message going. Now, if we have too many of a neurotransmitter or not enough of a neurotransmitter that can cause some issues for us with our behavior and our mental processes. These neurotransmitters are in charge of an incredible number of functions. But before I get to that, I do have one more of those little tutorials to show you, kind of highlighting what we just talked about. It will show you a little bit of how this process occurs in a little bit of an animation. So let me bring that up to share with you in hopes that it's helpful. Okay.
When a neuron receives enough messages via its dendrites, it fires. The cell body sends a message down the axon that causes the terminal buttons to release their stores of neurotransmitters. But how does the cell body determine when to send along a message? Neurons speak in a language that all cells in the body understand: electrochemical impulses. The level of electrical charge in the cell body is the trigger that causes the neuron to fire, releasing chemicals that, in turn, affect the electrical charge of neighboring neurons. It is important to understand that every neuron is covered by a cell membrane, a skin that separates the inside of the neuron from its surroundings. Ions, or electrically charged molecules, are dissolved in fluid on both sides of the membrane. Ions are either positive or negative, resembling two ends of a battery. The most important negative ion is chloride. The most important positive ions are potassium and sodium. The cell membrane is semi-permeable. It is constructed with gates that allow some ions to pass through while blocking others. These gates can open or close to allow more or fewer ions through at different times. When a point on the semi-permeable neural membrane is adequately stimulated by an incoming message, the membrane opens at that point and positively charged ions flow in. When a neuron is not sending a signal, it is said to be in a resting state. A resting neuron has more negative ions on the inside of the cell than on the outside. Because of this unequal distribution of electrically charged ions, we say that the neuron is polarized, negative inside and positive outside. The difference in electrical charge between the inside and outside of a resting neuron is negative 70 millivolts. This number is called the resting potential. While a neuron is at rest, its dendrites are receiving neurotransmitters that are sent out by other neurons nearby. If enough neurotransmitters are received, the electrical balance of the neuron changes. The reduction of the difference in electrical charge is a process called depolarization. An important threshold is crossed when the neuron receives enough neurotransmitters to depolarize the soma between negative 65 and negative 60 millivolts. At this point, the neuron fires. It generates its own electrochemical signal. The membrane covering the axon suddenly becomes more permeable, allowing large quantities of positive ions, usually sodium, to rush inside. In less than a millisecond, the neuron changes from negative 60 to positive 40 millivolts, completely reversing its electrical polarity. This reversal from negative 60 to positive 40 millivolts on the axon is called an action potential. The action potential is an all or none response. Either the neuron fires or it does not. It fires when the electrical threshold is crossed. Otherwise, the neuron remains in its resting state. The action potential causes the terminal buttons at the end of the axon to open up and release the neurotransmitters they hold. The neuron, in this way, communicates its message to neighboring neurons, muscles, or glands. For example, if you held your hand over a hot flame, the action potential of a motor neuron would pass along a message to help a muscle move.
All right. They really like that hot flame example, right? But just another way of viewing this whole process. I love the little animation showing you the triggering of the opening of those little gates to allow the ions to flow in and out, and then the neurotransmitters being released from the terminal buttons. So I think it's a great little animation just to kind of review that process. because this is really crucial for any kind of message that we want to send and all of the different behaviors that we're doing in any given moment. As I said earlier, that is linked in the lecture if you wanted to watch it again, the lecture on Canvas. But a couple of other things here I mentioned that neurotransmitters play a really important role in our behavior and our mental functioning, mental processes. There are quite a few different neurotransmitters, and you can see that they each have tasks that they tend to control, and then they have malfunctions as well, right? If somebody has too much dopamine, it can lead to hallucinations and different elements that we see often associated with schizophrenia. Serotonin plays a huge role in depression. When people don't have enough serotonin, they tend to show signs of depression. So we see that these neurotransmitters, in addition to allowing our neurons to communicate, can also cause some problems for us if they either are out of balance because of a natural deficiency in the body, or maybe they become out of balance due to consuming a substance or a drug that might alter them a little bit. One last thing, actually two more things before we wrap up the lecture. As I mentioned, neurons bundled together, bundles of axons together make up nerves, which make up the nervous system. Our nervous system, just to go over it a little bit, is a little bit complicated, right? It divides a couple of different times into different subsystems that all control their own elements and functions. But if we look at the nervous system, it divides twice into the peripheral and the central nervous systems. The central nervous system contains the brain and spinal cord, right? Our kind of control organ over our entire body and our communication superhighway. And the peripheral nervous system is all of the other connections, all of the other nerves that branch off of the brain and spinal cord connecting to the rest of the body. The peripheral nervous system also divides again into autonomic and somatic systems. Somatic controls all of the external actions of our skin and muscles, whereas the autonomic nervous system is in charge of the organs and the glands in our body. Autonomic sounds a lot like automatic, and it controls a lot of those very automatic, almost like unconscious processes of our organs and our glands. The autonomic nervous system divides one more time into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system is in charge of fight or flight, arousing us, gearing us up to face off a threat or a stressor of some kind. The parasympathetic nervous system is in charge of calming us down after a threat has passed. Basically, it's in charge of resting and digesting, and the sympathetic nervous system in charge of fight or flight. And we'll talk about both of these later in the semester when we talk about emotions, when we talk about the disorders, when we talk about stress. All of these systems will come back and we'll talk about them again. The last comment to share with you, one more system that tends to play a very important role and work very closely with the nervous system is the endocrine system. And this system is made up of a bunch of different glands, which you can see here in the picture: the pituitary gland, the adrenal glands, the thyroid gland, the ovaries, and the testes. All of these produce hormones. And hormones are our slow communication system within our body. Neurotransmitters house themselves within the nervous system, and they communicate very, very quickly. They allow us to react very fast to the environment around us. The endocrine system contains hormones which come from our glands into our bloodstream, and they tend to operate very slowly and on a much more global scale. Think of I just forgot to think of puberty, for example. During puberty, we have a lot of different hormones that are released, and it's kind of a slow process and slow changes that are occurring. Hormones and neurotransmitters are often released at the same time, and they work together, but they work in slightly different ways. One, again, is very slow and global, while neurotransmitters are very quick and they tend to affect the target right next to them, which would be the next neuron. So just a couple of key differences in the ways that they do work. And as I mentioned, I'm not going to lecture here on the brain just in the interest of time and keeping this from being incredibly long for you. But I would like you to make sure that you review the slides that are on the ebook site for the brain, and also make sure that you're reading the chapter elements related to the brain. There's a lot here about the different structures of the brain, which we sometimes divide up into older brain structures or more primitive structures. The limbic system, which plays a big part in our emotions and drives. The cerebral cortex, which is the part of our brain that is a lot higher level functioning, looking at the different lobes of the brain, which you'll see on the study guide, looking at those different lobes and where they are, what they're in charge of. Some tools for studying the brain. There's a bunch of different ways that we know all of this information, basically 4 different groups of techniques that we can use to study the brain and understand what is being controlled by which structures. I imagine some of you have had some of these tests, things like CAT scans and MRIs. Maybe not so much for PET scans, which are a little bit more rare, but again, make sure you read through this in the textbook. There's also a little bit about hemispheric specialization and the role that the left and right brain tend to play, the different things that they are in charge of. I have these kind of fun pictures of left versus right brain differences. And then the end of the chapter is a little bit about damage to the brain and a very famous accident by a railroad worker named Phineas Gage and some of the kind of compensation that his brain did in order to help with that accident. And then I have a little bit as well in the lecture about the 10% myth of the brain. So make sure that you look over the rest of the lecture in Canvas and read through the rest of the textbook. But I hope that you enjoyed the little lecture in this new format. And I hope that the captions were pretty decent. There were definitely a few times where it was off, but I do think that for the most part, they turned out pretty good. So make sure you watch everything else on Canvas, do all the required materials for this week, and I will see you all in our live stream.